Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here. So we are going to be taking a look at our final, the final one that I'm recording today, and that is going to be the Korean Peninsula with our topics of nations and nation states. So the reason why we're going to be looking at Korea is because it's a really good example of how different states demonstrate nationalism, and we're going to talk about what that is and define it. With that, let's take a look at our objectives. Again, make sure you get the warm-up done. It's hiding behind my face here, but let's take a look at what we're trying to accomplish here. So we are going to first be summarizing the events and the outcome of the Korean War, and then tying that into what we talked about earlier with things like containment and the Cold War. Once we do that, we're going to look at some of the more modern day issues and problems that North Korea faces and / causes. And then lastly, we will look at some competing forms of nationalism that have appeared on the Korean Peninsula, at least in the last few years, give or take. So let's get into our first forum, which is actually going to be looking at some 10 everyday activities that are illegal in North Korea that you might not know of. So you can click that link and watch it. We'll do it together in class. Once we do that, then we are going to go on to looking at the Korean War. Now, my reasons for looking at the Korean War here are twofold. Number one, it helps you understand why Korea is the way that North and South Korea look the way they do today. And then also, it ties into what we did a couple lessons ago on the Cold War, which is helpful. So let's get into it. With Korea, okay, to help you understand how Korea is going to fit into the Cold War, and then how it is going to kind of help make sense with nations and nation states, we have to talk about the Korean War. And with that, then, we have to talk about what happened after World War II, because that's directly relevant. So during World War II, kind of what happened with the Koreas, both North and South, is that the United States and the Soviet Union had invaded Korea. Now, after World War II, and after kind of the dust settled, so to speak, they decided to divide Korea into two, just this imaginary line called the 38th parallel, until Korea can be unified. There's not really any idea behind this in terms of it being, they're trying to like set up their claim so that they intend for this to be, a problem that will last 80 years into the future. No, that's not really the point here. The point is that with the end of World War II starting, and then also the start of the Cold War, they can't really figure out a solution to bringing, like, who should give up the territory and who shouldn't. Because with the Cold War going now, all of a sudden, these territories are immediately contested. And so once, again, they were thinking like, oh, they're eventually going to be unified. It'll be fine. Once the Cold War gets going, oh, no, that's absolutely not going to happen. And so once the Cold War starts, both countries set up basically countries that reflect their own images. So we get this very kind of like Stalinist, communist North Korea, and we get this very capitalist South Korea. Now, Stalin, immediately as basically the Cold War is starting to end, he's starting to, again, get the machine going in terms of spreading communism. And what starts to happen as they get into the 1950s is that Stalin starts to encourage North Korea to attack the South, to drive out the Americans and other, NATO-like powers that were there, and to unify the country. And he even provides the planning for this. So that then gets us to North Korea invading the South in the 1950s with 80,000 troops. And you can see this in the map here. We'll watch it in class. Now, what happens after that? Well, the Soviet Union at the time and the United States are part of something called the UN, which is brand new. Again, the United Nations just has been set up. It's very, very fresh. It's not been around for that long. And the UN is designed to work out problems like this, or to stop problems like this from happening, right, after World War II. The thing about the UN, though, that you need to know about with the Cold War is that the UN doesn't really do a lot in the Cold War. And the reason is because there's something on the UN called the Security Council. So the Security Council is the decision-making body for the UN, and it's made up of 5 members: the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union / Russia, and then also China. And China was kind of this oddball in there, and there were some issues happening with that, which we could get into, but they aren't important for this point. And because of some issues with China, the Soviet Union at this time was boycotting the UN Security Council. And anything that the council wants to do, okay, so let's say, for example, it's Britain, France, United States. They want to do something. If you propose something in the Security Council, if even one of those members vetoes it, it can't happen. Well, just coincidentally happens that at this time, when North Korea invades South Korea, the Soviet Union's boycotting the UN Security Council, and the Chinese representative hasn't been seated yet because of some other issues. So what happens? The U.S., President Truman, they ran through a resolution through the UN that authorizes the use of force to protect South Korea. So for the first time, hey, look at that. The UN's going to be used to try to, prevent one country from taking over another. So UN troops arrive, and as you can see on the map there that you can watch, South Korea's in a pretty dire position when UN troops arrive under the command of U.S. General down here. His name's Douglas MacArthur, who was very famous from World War II. So there you go. You can see that on the map. It is not a good spot that they're in. Now, when the UN shows up, they make very little progress at first until there's separate landings at Incheon, which is this blue arrow on the last slide, and this causes a mass retreat by North Korean troops and soldiers. Now, Truman, who's the U.S. president at the time, and this gets relevant to what we're going to talk about here in terms of other stuff with the Cold War, is that Truman, as they start to march northward, gives MacArthur permission to take back all of Korea and unify it. But he tells MacArthur, don't go too far north, because China at this point is a communist country, and this is going to be extremely relevant for what we're going to talk about later. Well, MacArthur goes too far. He gets to the Yalu River, which is the border, which is right on the border of China, near the border of China, and then all of a sudden, Chinese troops just pour over the border, 260,000 of them, in or on the side of North Korea. And the UN gets thrown back to that kind of around where that 38th parallel line is. Now, at this point, this is where things get kind of crazy. Truman asks, like, hey, MacArthur, that U.S. commander, goes to Truman's like, hey, I want to use 34 atom bombs and use them against the Chinese. And Truman's like aghast at this and says no. MacArthur gets replaced, but that's not relevant for our point here. How the war ends is that they fight to a stalemate. They hit this, kind of get back to where this 38th parallel line is, and then Truman uses the opportunity to ask for an armistice. And an armistice is just like a pause in the fighting, and the negotiations to end the war never happened. So the armistice that paused it is still in place today. It is the longest running war that the United States has ever been in, ever. So that's kind of how the Korean War ends. And all of a sudden now we have two sides set, North Korea, South Korea, separated by the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, which is the most heavily fortified border between two countries that has ever existed. So there's your exit ticket. You can complete it right there. And then I'll talk about what we're going to do for the rest of the lesson. So with the stage being set there in North Korea, we're going to take a look at some of the problems that North Korea faces and causes, because again, this communist Stalinist, slash Stalinist country that gets set up, it's going to create a remarkable problem for China, the United States, even North Korea itself. And we're going to look at some of the problems that North Korea faces and causes, and then maybe think about some potential solutions and discuss those and what you would do. Once we do that, then we're going to look at dueling nationalism and some ways that nationalism manifests itself on the Korean Peninsula. And again, we talked about what makes a nation in our last block. Nationalism is how people identify themselves as part of a nation. Okay, that's kind of the easy way to look at it. And again, we could look at some different elements here. We could look at language, territory, culture, economic history, or economic interests and shared history. But I decided to take it on a little bit of a different tack, and that is some kind of NCAA style brackets. And we're going to kind of vote on which form of nationalism that you would most like to learn about. So as you can see here, and we'll do this in class, and we will vote on which one we want to study. I've got a bracket here of different forms of nationalism for both North and South Korea. So you can see we've got different titles for these, and as a class, we will vote on which one we want to study and read about in class. And so, for example, North Korean haircuts, or balloon leaflets for South Korea, or mandatory military service, looking at ethnicity and race in South Korea, South Korea cinema, and then also got North Korea cinema. So we can vote on which one we would most like to learn about. And so, for example, what you'll do then is, let's say the class, we decide to study BTS over North Korean haircuts. And then we're like, oh, let's look at North Korean nukes. And then we'll have to decide which one do we want to study. And we'll, you see, we can click one. Oh, hey, look at that. We can go link to it, and we can learn more about it, and we'll read it as a class. So each of these things kind of is a kind of copyable element that you can then vote upon and then go and study more. So all that right there. Okay, these are all links out to good authoritative articles on all of these issues and forms of nationalism. What you're then going to do down here in this red box is you're going to say, let's say eventually we end up with our champion being Jusha. I learned how to pronounce this, but I know I just butchered it. What you're going to then do is down below, then it says it shows nationalism on the Korean Peninsula by, and then write out an answer. Couple sentences, 2-3 sentences, something like that, with some good detail. So once you do that, you'll turn a copy of this slide. Okay, you'll go to File, download as a JPEG, turn it into Schoology, and that'll be the end of this lesson. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.